Good evening, Mount Olive Baptist Church. We are grateful that you have joined us again for this third installment of this series, Managing Grief. The first week, we were so happy to understand the 5 stages of grief. And last week, we spent some time thinking through what does it mean for how do Black men grieve and how that is different from how others grieve and how we can best support Black men through their grief. And this week, we are so grateful to start this Bible study on racial trauma, managing grief due to racial trauma, rather. But before we start, would you please join me in a word of prayer? God, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for your grace that really showers down on us. I pray, God, that your Holy Spirit will be here as we discuss your word and also as we discuss this issue of racial trauma. I pray, God, that through this Bible study, we can bring healing and hope in no other name but the strong name of Jesus, who is the Christ. Amen. Amen. We are joined today by a special guest. I get to see her every day, but it's my wife, the Dr. Siobhan Moore-Laban. I almost said Reverend Doctor, but Dr. Siobhan Moore-Laban, and she is the president-elect for APA, that's the American Psychological Association, Society of Counseling Psychology. So we're grateful to join her. She spent many years working in the field of trauma. So we think that this is a great opportunity to ask the questions about the intersections of grief and racial trauma. She's also the campus director for the Washington, D.C. campus of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Welcome to Bible Study Land.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
We are grateful that you have joined us, have consented that through my begging and asking and pleading that you have said yes to being here. But we really want to unpack this idea of racial trauma. But to get started, we're going to take a look at the text, and then we'll give you some time to tell us all we need to know about trauma and racial trauma. So the text for the night is taken from Matthew chapter 2, and we'll be reading from verse 16 to 18. That's Matthew 2, verses 16 to 18. And the word of the Lord reads, "When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more." The word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. So to get us started, interested to hear, so racial trauma. We'll want to break down this term. This is not a term we discussed in this series. So What is racial trauma? And hand it off to you right there.
Yeah, sure. So I think before we can really jump into talking about what racial trauma is, maybe we'll start with trauma, just understanding trauma and then understanding the components of it that sometimes can be race-based. So trauma in and of itself, you can think about as events that are stressful, events that might overwhelm one's ability to cope. So sometimes more than just kind of your everyday stressors that you have, these are heightened events. They might be events that are life-threatening. They might be events that make you think that that there's going to be harm coming towards you, that your life is in danger, that there is a threat of death, and that threat of death can be real, right? It can be actual threat and death. It can also be the perception of threat of death or harm, or again, that your life is in danger. Sometimes people think about trauma and they think about really big events, like a single most event that might happen, like a car accident or the death of someone, or things that are kind of larger scale, I guess you could say, in a way. Sometimes in the field, we might talk about that as like a big T trauma. But there are also traumas that are not kind of the bigger events that you might think of as a car accident. We might call them little t traumas in the field, but they might be things that are repeated, that are prolonged, these events that happen over and over and over again that still cause you some level of feeling like your life is in danger, or your safety is threatened, or that there's some harm that is that's gonna come your way. So that's what we can kind of think of as like, what is trauma, right?
Yeah.
And then when we think about what is racial trauma specifically, you can think about kind of a race-based trauma. So everything that we just talked about, and then understanding that sometimes there's a racial undertone to things. There's a racial component to things. There's a way in which the traumatic stress that a person experiences is based in race. It can be the culmination of various like personal events that have happened. It can be vicarious events, meaning that you've seen it. Yeah. And trauma is the same way too, right? So trauma can happen to you directly. It can also be very traumatic to witness something happening. So something that happens to you, or something that you see happening to someone close to you that you care about, something that's unexpected, that you witness, those sorts of things can be trauma. And so we can think about and understand many ways in which what we see in the world around us that sometimes is happening to us and sometimes we're seeing happen in other people are based in racial injustices and racial incidents. So sometimes these sorts of race-based traumas might be very overt and in your face, right? Sometimes they might be very covert and kind of subtle, nuanced, things that continue to come up over time. So that's both kind of what trauma is, and then also thinking about what racial trauma is.
Yeah. So I think over the past year, well, forget the past year. I mean, like for
centuries,
right? But I think it's been concentrated in the past year, right? Yeah. But over the past centuries, I think the African American community, Black folk, have been experiencing this racial trauma. And so a question I have is, what is the connection to grief? How does grief and all that we learned about last couple weeks about grief, how does that intersect with racial trauma?
Yeah. So, in the Bible study so far, I mean, you all have talked about kind of the manifestation of grief. Like, what is grief? What does it look like? What's the expression of it in terms of mourning? And oftentimes, as we think and talk about grief, we're thinking about maybe the loss of life, like grieving someone, grieving something that has been lost. That occurs in racial trauma too, right? Mm-hmm. We think about the killings of Black men and women in our society, and what we have really seen that, again, has been going on for centuries, but that has been really heightened in terms of our ability to see it through social media, through news coverage, and so forth. We've really seen it much more in your face on a larger scale in the past years and decades. So seeing the loss of that life is something to grieve, right? Mm-hmm. And that is connected to racial trauma. And so you might be mourning and grieving the loss of life because it's someone that you know that has maybe died at the hands of the police, for example. You might also be grieving and mourning because you have a level of identity proximity to that person, right? There's something about yourself that you see in the person that has lost their life or that has experienced brutality, right? So trauma and grief doesn't always have to be about death, right? Yeah. There are other ways of harm and perceived threat and actual threat that are traumatic that aren't always ending in death, but sometimes it does. And so there's a level of seeing yourself in that you grieve. There's a level of, I think, collectivistic culture that we have in the Black community where we really think of our brothers and sisters as our brothers and sisters, both in Christ and in ethnic and racial identity and in culture. And so there's the seeing of harm to that individual and to our community that brings about the same feelings of grief that have been discussed, right? Yeah. And I think that there's also sometimes an added layer to grieving racial trauma incidents because When something happens that you grieve, it's a loss of life, you've experienced divorce, you've lost a job, there's something there that you're grieving. I think people naturally empathize and understand, right? They're kind of like, I'm really sorry that you had that experience. I can't imagine what you must be going through. When people are grieving because of things that are related to racial trauma and the loss of life of Black men and women, our brothers and sisters, or the loss that we perceive could exist even within our own family as we think about sending our family members out into the world, when that sort of grief happens around racial trauma, I think that there's sometimes a questioning of like, why are you so broken up about that, you know, or why is it sticking with you for so long, or, you know, you don't really know that person, in addition to the added layers of what we see in the media in terms of looking at the person who might have lost their life and criminalizing them, or thinking about all the negative ways in which they are at fault for their own death, right? This victim blaming. So there are really, I think, a lot more layers to grief sometimes when it comes to grieving racial trauma than it may be grieving trauma that is not race-based. Like everything else in our society, just like it's layered and it's much more complicated.
Yeah. And I guess the question that I have is, so what is the effect of, so I think in the past year, and actually I'll say in the past 2 or 3 years rather, the fact that we can see it, right? Like it, not even like seeing like a picture of what happens at the end, but see what has happened. When we look at, you know, George Floyd, Philando Castile, trying to remember the other ones that were, there's quite a few.
Sandra Bland.
The fact that we can see it, how does that affect us, you know? Like I remember when George Floyd was killed, I remember watching it one time, and it, you know, at that point it was on all the time, you know, and compounded by COVID. So there was nothing else to watch, but it was on the news, it was on your social media. And I just could only watch it one time. Like I didn't need to watch it again, because at that point I just felt like overwhelmed. It was just like one time was enough. What's the effect of, and I don't want to make a judgment statement on it, but should we be rewatching it, or like what's the effect of that on our levels of grief? Or
Yeah. So I think for each person has to make the decision of watching or not watching, listening, not listening, and to the extent that you will, right? So it's kind of to do it or not to do it, and then how much of it to do. I think that's a decision that each person has to make, and some of it depends on what else is going on in your life and where you are in your life at the moment, and how much you can tolerate and handle. And I think some of it also depends on where you are within your trauma that this has caused, right? So we spoke a little bit about what trauma is in terms of these events that can be life-threatening, that can make you feel like your life is in danger, that can make you feel like harm is coming your way, or it actually is coming your way, that you can experience for yourself, that you can witness in other people. Race-based trauma or racial trauma being then the trauma that is based in kind of racial discrimination and bias and everything that comes with that trauma that is because of your race, right? In a lot of ways of what we're seeing of the killings of our Black and brown men and women. So, but when we think about kind of trauma reactions in and of themselves and how people are responding to trauma, we think about 4 different types of trauma responses that people have. So one is kind of intrusive memories, right? So you experience something traumatic, and then immediately and after some time, likely, you have these kind of memories that keep coming up about the trauma. It could be in dreams, it could be in nightmares, it could be just kind of your mind taking you to that place, like drifting off into it when you're not even trying to think about it. So one of the reasons that we think about it as being an intrusive thought is because you're not sitting here trying to recall what has occurred, right? What has happened to me. it's just something that pops in. It could be that it pops in because you're triggered by something, right? So watching on the news the killing of George Floyd can trigger for you your own traumatic experiences in life as it relates to you feeling like your life is in jeopardy, or interactions or run-ins that you've had with the police or with other citizens who might be using, stand your ground or other laws kind of against you that have been created. So there's a part of this memories that kind of keep coming back, and ways in which what you see on the news can trigger that. And what you see on the news can also become a part of those memories. So if I'm saying that this is a traumatic experience, the death of George Floyd, for example, you watching that can also be a traumatic experience for you. And so how many times are you going to watch and experience that trauma? The other thing that comes up for people when it comes to trauma is a very natural avoidance of the trauma, which I think is connected to how much of this should I watch, right? Yeah. So a natural avoidance of the trauma is that you might avoid people, places, things, memories, anything that is that reminder, you may try to avoid that. And that's a pretty natural and understandable thing to do, actually. I say sometimes to patients, or when I'm working with students and trying to help them understand trauma, I might, help them to understand no one really wakes up in the morning saying, like, I really hope I have a horrible day. I really was hoping for bad things today. Yeah. I want to think bad things. I want to feel bad things. Just like, oh, wouldn't it be great if it was a bad day? Like, no one wakes up thinking that. So when we have experiences and we come up against those things that are negative and awful and traumatic, we have a real natural tendency to pull back and to say, I don't want anything to do with that, right? I need to kind of course correct my day. So there's a natural tendency to avoid when we're having these traumatic experiences and memories. The other thing that comes up is an arousal, right? And the arousal response is something where you're like always on guard for the next thing that can happen. Now you're leaving your house and you're looking around, or you're hearing a police siren and you might freeze a little bit. Your heart may start racing. Yeah. You might start sweating. You might get really nervous and anxious. So there are ways in which your body is kind of like on edge and on guard for something to happen. Another part of the arousal sometimes is a startle response, like that you're kind of jumpy, right? That somebody cannot just come and sneak up behind you when you're a person who has experienced trauma, because you're always watching for your safety, yeah. Right? And so that's a part of that. And the last part is a negative change in your thinking and your feeling, or we might say cognitions and mood. In psychological terms, but a negative change of your thinking and your feeling in one way. And so that might be sadness, right? That might be depression, which I know you all talked about last week a little bit with Dr. Crawford. That might be loss of concentration. You can't get your work done because your mind is shifting and wondering and going off, and maybe even into the intrusive memories. And there's a change in your thinking where you're not feeling as safe. You're feeling like you're being threatened. You're feeling like, can I trust people, right? All of these things. And so those are responses to trauma. If you have experienced trauma in watching the killings of Black and brown women, of experiencing family members who have experienced it, of experiencing levels of brutality and threat yourself as it relates to racial injustice, if you're a person who has experienced that and you've been traumatized, it would be really difficult to sit and watch all day that same trauma on the news, or every time you open your phone to see it on Facebook or Instagram or whatever platform you're using, or to even read about it, if you're reading the Washington Post or wherever you're getting your news sources from. So if you're in that position of already having experienced the trauma, and the trauma is constantly in your face, it may be in your best interest to distance a little bit, to try to take it in pieces. It also may be in your best interest to delve into it, right? So even though avoidance is normal, and avoidance can be helpful, right? Yeah. So this kind of like, I don't want to deal with that. At the end of the day, it is all still there. And so the idea that we're not going to deal with it, or I'm just never going to watch it, or I'm never going to see it, is also not necessarily possible. And so it just becomes something that is like pushing through, you trying to back off and avoid it anyways.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I like how you framed those 5 things, right? And
4.
4. Oh, I thought it was 5. I don't know. I counted 5. Right?
Well, the last one kind of has 2 in it. So
Yeah, see, thank you very much.
I'll give you that.
So I've been listening. For the 4/5 things, we have a question from the audience that dovetail well. Christian Whitley asks, as a teacher, I see more of my students live in fear-based thinking because of police brutality they've been exposed to. How does one help ease a person that carries that traumatic thinking? How do you help, I guess, de-escalate, or I don't know if that's de-escalation, or whatever. See, this is why I'm not a psychologist. But we want to encourage, if you have any questions, please pop it into the chat on YouTube or on Facebook.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So what would you do for this student and for others, that are experiencing this? I think, one, it depends on what your position is to the person, right? So in this specific example for Christian, as someone who's working with students as an educator, you want to create space for people to bring the things that are really happening in their life. So I think one of the more difficult things that we experience and try to do when it comes to supporting other people is try to figure out how do we create space where people can bring what is happening without also opening kind of a can that can't be contained. And I think when it comes to trauma, even for psychologists, right? When it comes to trauma, people can be really hesitant to talk with people about the traumatic events that they have experienced, or to talk with them about things that they have seen and witnessed. And I think a reason for that, often what I have heard other psychologists say, and psychologists in training who I'm helping to become psychologists, they'll say, well, once I open it, it may get worse for the person in terms of what they feel, or there's so much emotion in the room that what do I do with it and how do I contain it? Or again, this thinking that like I'm gonna make it worse for them because I've asked about something that's really harmful or hurtful, in both. But the thing is that it is there for the person, and they're actually bringing it into the space every day anyways, right? So your students specifically, or in other situations, my students included, what they experience in their life on a daily basis is coming into that space.
Yeah.
So one thing that you can do is acknowledge it, right? Like, give space for people to actually have voice to say, yes, this thing that you have experienced is happening and the impact on you is real, and we have space to talk about that. I think the other important thing to remember is that you've experienced it as well. We all experience, just like you've talked about grief over the past 2 weeks and how the grief process is different for everybody, right? You've talked about the stages and the ebb and flow. And it could be that a person is in one place and goes to the next and comes back, right? Trauma responses are the same. We can experience the exact same thing and not have the same response to it. You might feel traumatized and I might not. But regardless, we have both experienced something, right? And so for me, even with my students, I try to remember and bring into the room, I'm having my own reactions and thoughts to what has happened as well. And that's interacting. So I have to leave space. I try to share with them how I'm processing and what I'm thinking. It may depend on the age of your students, but there's remembering your experience and bringing it to the room, remembering they have an experience and allowing for space into the room. And also taking an approach then to working with them that we would call trauma-informed. A trauma-informed approach, I think it may be the simplest way, means understanding people's life context as it relates to trauma and trying to understand why someone is doing what they're doing through a perspective of how is that helping them in that moment, right? And that could be something that's negative behavior in the classroom, but where is that coming from? And it's not to make excuses for what people are doing or to say, oh, because there's racial injustice in this world, you can come into whatever space and kind of do whatever you want. But it is acknowledging that like people are really going through something major here, and people are being traumatized and people are having trauma reactions that you may not understand if you don't try to contextualize it through the lens of that trauma, if that makes sense.
And I think to take it one step further, I know we're thinking about racial trauma, but I think what you're saying is applicable to many different types of trauma, right?
Absolutely.
And I think about like family systems, right? Like in a lot of families, there are like all these secrets about trauma, right?
Yeah.
And we kind of take the approach of we're never going to talk about it, we're never going to touch it, but it's still real and alive, and we wonder why that young man is acting the way he's acting, or that young lady's acting the way we're acting. Is it because we are not processing some of this grief and processing like these like family secrets, and we think like and I think many folks feel like we should just avoid it and just keep it at bay instead of spending time and doing hard work to unpack all the family trauma that's there.
Yeah. So yes, to all of that. I talked a little bit about avoidance, right? Being one thing that happens when somebody has experienced trauma, and the fact that avoidance makes sense sometimes in the moment. The avoidance can allow you to do the things that you need to do in your day. That avoidance can allow you to get to work. That avoidance can allow you to take care of your family and raise your child and manage all of the things of life that you have to manage. But if you're in that avoidance for too long and you never deal with the thing that needs to be dealt with, that thing is not going away, right? Those intrusive memories, those dreams that you're having, the images that you're seeing on TV, unfortunately, the fact that there will be another hashtag of say somebody's name, like those things are not going away. And so if you continue to avoid them, in a short term, it may be beneficial and there may be some help to you, but in a long term, what happens is that it continues to fester. And in families, it can become kind of a secret that nobody is talking about, but people are behaving around, if that makes any sense. Yeah. So even though I am not vocalizing what it is that has happened in my life or that I have witnessed or seen or experienced, and that contributes to the way in which I parent, or I am a sibling, or I interact with my family, or my interpersonal style. I may not be speaking the fact that is happening, but I am behaving the way that is happening, right? Yeah. And there's a real implication for that. One thing that sometimes I explain, again, when I'm working with people to help them understand what trauma is it's a metaphor of, if we're sitting in this room, and let's say that there's like a flood in the building and this whole carpet floods and it's soaking wet, right? I could just kind of try to air out the carpet with some fans and things like that, try and dry it out. But if that doesn't work and mildew builds below it, if I didn't do a good enough job, what are my options to deal with the mildew under the carpet? If I came in and I just lit a whole bunch of candles, right, put out some potpourri and opened up a window, that's not actually going to solve the issue that is underneath that, under the carpet. And so even though the room might smell a little better for a minute, my mind might be taken off the fact that there's mildew going on under the carpet. The harmful effects of that mildew under the carpet are long lasting. There's health effects to that. And the same is true for trauma. There's health effects to trauma. There's psychological effects to that. And so what I really need to do is, not do all of the candles. Maybe that worked in the short term because you and I needed to do Bible study and we can't be sitting in here with the smell of mildew or, whatever it is. But in the long term, I'm gonna have to take out a part of the carpet, clean up underneath there, see what's actually going on and resolve the issue, right? And so the same is true for dealing with trauma. In the short term, there really may be many reasons why you're not at a place to deal with it right then, or why you can't watch that news story, or why you have to do something to continue on with your day so that you're not stuck and kind of falling apart. But in the long term, if you don't go back to it, it hasn't gone anywhere, and the consequences of it haven't gone anywhere either. They're just kind of waiting.
Yeah, absolutely. And we want to encourage folks to ask questions in the chat. We have another question, and then we're going to turn our attention to the text a little bit. But the question is, can you discuss, I guess, how trauma relates to mental illness?
So, yes. So if you think about certain diagnoses, perhaps, is what the question is around. There's certain diagnoses like post-traumatic stress disorder. There are also other trauma-related disorders, as we might call them, which have to do with more like acute trauma symptoms. So in general, somebody has experienced a trauma. I've gone through kind of the 4 different categories of responses that people might have to that. And the way that it then begins to connect to something like PTSD is because it has been unresolved for some time. And there are a number of symptoms of that 4 that I listed: the intrusive memories, the avoidance symptoms, the arousal symptoms, where I was talking about kind of being on edge and geared up, and irritability is actually an arousal symptom, as is actually sleep disturbance. So sometimes you'll see insomnia, and then the last one, or last 2, as you like to think about them, Daryl, are negative cognitions, negative change in your cognitions and your mood, although they're together, so there are 4. So if you have those symptoms, if you have enough of them, if you've had them long enough, and even Dr. Crawford was talking a little bit about this last week in terms of it interfering. If it is also interfering in multiple aspects of your life, right? Your relationships with people, your work, your home life, your own personal well-being. If it's interfering across domains, then we might think about it as reaching a point of being PTSD.
Yeah.
Everyone who experiences trauma doesn't experience PTSD, right? So as I said before, we can experience the same event and have different responses to it. So an event can be traumatic, and you may have some of those reactions very quickly, but they may resolve after 30 days, let's say. And so it may not move into a place of being considered PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. So so I hope, Ms. Wanda, that helps answer your question as relates to, as you said, trauma and racial trauma and PTSD. And I think if we had more time, we'll break down, I think people throw around PTSD quite often. It's one of those words, just like depression. People just throw it out like, oh, I'm having PTSD, I'm having a moment or whatever. And that may not necessarily be the right term, but we'll save that for some. You could email her if you want to know more about that. But turning our attention a little bit to the text right now, which in Matthew, we find Herod. This comes right after Herod told the wise men. This is the nativity story. Herod told the wise men to come back and tell me where Jesus is, where the Messiah rather is to be born. And Herod, in an effort to kill the Messiah, he killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under. And then we have this quotation from the book of Jeremiah that now appears in Matthew chapter 2 that says, "A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more." And what we see in this text is some of the same trauma that we have been discussing this evening. For one thing that I see here in this text is this is an action of state-sponsored violence, right? Herod is the governor of Judea at this time, and he asks them to kill all these kids. And then Rachel has a response to this trauma, right? She starts grieving. She says, the Bible says, a voice was heard, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be consoled. So in response to this trauma, we have this huge amount of grief in this text. And this made me think about the world that we live in right now, right? In terms of, we have seen with the deaths of Philando Castile, we have seen with the deaths of Trayvon Martin, we have seen with the deaths of Elijah McClain, we have seen with the deaths of Sandra Bland with, after all these events happen, you see the mother comes on TV, right? And the mother's there weeping, and she's in the middle of a press conference, and she's just weeping. She kind of refuses to be consoled in that moment, that there's this kind of response. And I just find it very interesting how like when we suffer at the hands of the police, how it really caused not only the mother to weep, but I hear from other mothers who also have children. They start talking about like, that's kind of like my child is that age, and that could have been my child. Or even when Trayvon Martin was killed, President Obama said, "My son, if I had a son, he would have looked like Trayvon," or what have you. So there's this kind of collective grief that we experience as a community, and I'm wondering, like, how do we heal from the grief as a community? Like, what are the markers of how do we heal as a community? Because the grief is there, we've went through, the trauma exists. How do we grieve as a community, and how do we move towards healing? You know, it's a continuum, so I don't think we ever want to get to a place of acceptance, right? But how do we grieve?
Yeah. So, you know, when I think about the mother's perspective of this, obviously as a Black mother, I think about my own son. I think about our own son, you know, Elijah. There's such identity in terms of proximity to something, right? Like sometimes I think you can think about like how close you are to something is how you might also identify with it. And I think that we are very close in racial and ethnic proximity, right? And in status or label and role as a mother proximity. And so I was saying a little bit earlier when we got it started, a part of the grief is because you see yourself in this loss, you see your family in this loss. As a mother, you know, you see your child in this loss. I see, you know, my husband, I see you in this loss, and that has a very heavy and weighty impact. We are a community as Black people that are collectivistic in a lot of ways, right? So I think about like, as a Black person, the African proverb, "I am because we are," right? And thinking about the collective kind of we in that our success is together. You succeed and you have gotten places because of those that have come before you. You struggle and people rally around to support you together. There's a collective movement in the way that we go through life, right? I think also even in biblical terms, right? I think about Romans and think about the idea of rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn, right? Like we are collectively as brothers and sisters in that together. And so I think that there is a way that we share in the grief. And as you're asking, you know, I think there's a way in which we support each other and move in the grief. A part of moving through the grief for me and first and foremost, I think always is that you have to acknowledge that it exists. You really can't solve things or move through things or fix things that you're still in a space of not knowing if it's real or not, right? And so I think one thing is racial trauma is real. So like, let's acknowledge that, let's put that out there. Your grief, your pain, your anger, your despair, your depression, your confusion, and all of the steps that you all have talked about in the past 2 weeks, that is real, and the transition around them is real, right? So we have to acknowledge that piece as well. I think the other piece of working towards healing together is allowing for a level of vulnerability. Oftentimes in our community, you know, there's a perception that women and also that men, I mean, we talk about like the strong Black woman. I think there's also the strong Black man perception, right? Of how you're supposed to be. You all talked a little bit about this last week in terms of, you know, crying and showing emotion and being vulnerable. But it's the expression of that, like you're talking about, for these mothers that have lost their children. It's the expression of that in front of others that allows for that connection connection and to know that, you know what, look what has happened, right? Because of what's going on in society and because of the racial injustice and prejudice and discrimination that exists. Look what has happened and look how it has impacted me and how I feel. Like, there's no need to put on that mask and to pretend that I am not hurting and broken and in pain about it, because it is in that broken place of acknowledgement that you will be able to get to something else. It's not gonna bring your loved one back, but it may allow you to move through some of the emotions that come with that. I think immediately about Emmett Till, right? And about his mother making the decision to have the funeral with the open casket to say, look what you have done and look how I am grieving this. And the decision to do that was not just about herself and her own grief and place of needed healing, but was about the community and letting the community see what happens. And like, let's not have this in secrecy and pretend that this doesn't exist or that we are not suffering for it, because the hiding and secrecy, like we talked about the carpet with the mildew and the mold, is only going to continue to fester, right? So we've got to bring voice to what is happening. We've got to bring voice to how we feel, which requires a level of vulnerability that I would say we desperately need to get to a place of healing.
Yeah, I think that goes in line with this text, right? So this is what's known as the massacre of the holy innocents. And the interesting thing about this text is when they look through the history of this, of the records of Herod, they don't find any record of this, right? But it's interesting in this text that this is the only place in history that we actually hear about these babies dying, because it was actually so commonplace that it would not have never made the records, right? Even the crucifixion of Jesus, right, would never make the records, because from their point of view, it's just another person that died, you know? It's just another person that died. And these are just a small little town called Bethlehem. He killed a few kids. It will never make the records. But there's something about this grief, right, that brings voice, right? And I think, I don't think we view grief in that way. And I think you mentioned this with Emmett Till, right? It helps bring voice, and by bringing voice, it also brings some healing. It says that something happened here, right? We're not going to just throw this under the rug and light some candles, to use your metaphor. It kind of puts a stake in the ground that something happened, especially when you see it, this woman, Rachel, which is a metaphor, right? When you see her weeping and refusing to be consoled, it says that something is going on here that we need to spend some time in, and not to push past our grief, but actually stay in it. And I think that's helpful for a country, right, that has for many years denied. I mean, there's millions of, we were just at the African American Museum again this past weekend for like our 5th or 6th time. And it was amazing to see, like, just to see how many people were lynched, right, who never had a voice, right? How many millions of people who decided to jump into the ocean because they didn't want to be enslaved here in the States, and all the millions of people who have died under the whip and the lash and the brutality, right? It is important that there is a moment to grieve. And one thing that's also interesting about this text is that this is Rachel who's grieving. So it's a metaphor. It's kind of like the ancestors are grieving about what is going on here, so that even from the grave, they're weeping. Something is going on, and I think that says something to us today about how grief is kind of a protest, how grief brings voice, how grief is healthy, and that's why taking up the carpet and sweeping it out and changing the carpet is an important part of grief and needed.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking about that, I was thinking about, there's a way in which within your grief, a lot of times we might think about, I need to do something, right? So one, yes, we've talked about acknowledging it. Like it's real, it is present, be with it, right? Allowing yourself to be vulnerable, stay in it, experience it with God, right? Talk to God about it, lean on God about it. There are so many things that we don't understand, but we seek God and his understanding and his peace around what we don't understand. But we don't fully move through it very quickly, right? Sometimes you just gotta stay in it, right? And when you are ready, and sometimes even actually as you're in it, there are still ways to make some movement. And so some of that has to do with activism, right? As you were talking about like ancestors and people that have come before us and not having voices, I was thinking, you know, they have voices, and sometimes their voices were silenced by other people, and sometimes they were using their voices very strongly, right? They were using their voices in song. They were using their voices to communicate. Over centuries and over decades, we have seen through movements, civil rights movements, people are using their voices to amplify the cries of many, right? Just like here in the text, right? We're amplifying the cry and the grief that exists, and we're asking for change as a part of the healing so that the grief doesn't have to continue in situation after situation. And sometimes that activism, what we're seeing now, people marching in the streets all summer around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, right? That activism can also be healing. That activism can help you lift and amplify your voice, and to help lift and amplify voices of those who are being silenced, or who may not at that moment be in a position, like maybe they're in the position of rest. Maybe they have said, I can't watch this anymore, I've got to turn off the TV. I can't go to another protest. I need my own moment. But this, again, collective we that we talked about, right? Being a very collectivistic cultural group that we are here, I can step in and carry that sign and carry that torch and raise my voice for you while you are resting. And when I need to rest, you can come in. And that is how I think we get to a collective healing, right? Is understanding that we are in a journey of mourning and of hope together, and getting to the end.
Yeah, and I like what you said about, and I don't know, it's sticking with me now, this idea of staying in it and staying in the moment. And I think, as we've been saying for the past 3 weeks, like, a lot of people want us to kind of rush off to acceptance, but there are some things that we should not accept, right? And maybe in racial trauma is one of those things where we should never accept as come to a place we can make peace that this person passed away or was murdered. But we should not be, we should have a certain level of I kind of want to say holy grief in us, right? To a grief that is, some will say like a righteous indignation, right? We should have a level of grief that we carry with us, right? All the time, that reflects on, you know, all that is going on in the world. It goes back to last scripture we did last week. Blessed are they that mourn, right? There's a blessing in this mourning about racial justice. And I think, and maybe you could push back on this, right? But there's a blessing in mourning about some of the trauma that goes on in our lives and in our families. And I think we have not spent enough time mourning those things. And we don't want to use the term generational curses or anything like that, but there's a lot of things that happen in our families that we have not spent the time just sitting in it. And by sitting in it and doing that grief, like, so this and that happened to me, and I need to sit in it, and from there healing then could come on. Like, I think there's that, I kind of want to say it's a little, you know, I use this word a lot, but it's kind of demonic, right? The idea to always push past things, and I think we see that in American culture. White folk are saying, y'all not over on this, y'all not done with this mourning about George Floyd. But even people in our family are also saying to us, you're still talking about this thing that happened to you, you know? One last quote, and I'll give you the floor. John Spence says, you cannot change what you do not confront, right? And I think that is an important thought. Like, until we sit and mourn and grieve certain things, until we're like Rachel, that we're refusing to be consoled about certain things and confronted, things will remain the same.
Yeah. I think as one of the things I said earlier, the first thing is to acknowledge it. You cannot change what you don't understand, and you won't understand it if you haven't sat in it and sat with it and unpacked it and understood what is beneath it. And as you were talking, I was thinking about generational trauma, right? What has come before it, what has existed in generations as a people within our own families. Unless we are sitting with and understanding that, it's really difficult to move forward and to move past that.
Yeah, yeah, and so how do we reclaim, not reclaim, wrong use of words. What will you say to someone, I guess I'm asking for what resources do you have for someone who finds himself, who sees all that's going on in the world around racial trauma, but I think we want to broaden it out a little bit. I think we went a little broader, who has all these intrusive thoughts, I can't name all 4 or 5 of the things, right? But y'all heard it, she said it a couple times, right? What are the resources? What are the things that they should do that are experiencing these?
Yeah. So there's always therapy, right? Yeah. I wouldn't be a psychologist if I didn't say we can consider therapy, right? And therapy is not just for, I've reached a point in my life where I don't know what else to do, and so I need somewhere to go. It can certainly be that. Therapy is also a place of, there's just a lot going on, and I need a place to unpack it and to explore it and to get into the middle of it in ways that I just haven't been able to do on my own before. So there is therapy, and it's been reviewed here in Bible study, some different ways to connect, but there are, there's Psychology Today, which is a site that you can go on and you can find therapists, and you can see who takes your insurance, or if you want to do self-pay. What I actually like about Psychologist Today is that you can read a little bit about the person. So most people will put up a bio, they'll talk about what their specialties are. You definitely want to look for somebody that identifies themselves as understanding and having a desire to address issues of racism and racial injustice. So that's a part of it. You can also call your insurance company. The number on the back of your insurance card is where the number to call is located. When you call them, you can tell them what kind of provider you're looking for and what area you want a provider in, whether that's by your work or by your house, or maybe it doesn't matter. And they will actually give you a full listing of who takes your insurance in those areas that you have specified. I would actually then suggest that you go on Psychology Today and look them up, or just online in general, find their website and look them up. And I think, as Dr. Crawford was talking about last week, stick with it. It is so important to have a match, right? I mean, you're 2 people in a situation, the therapist and yourself. And so it's important for that to be a match. It may not be with the first person. It doesn't mean it never will be, right? So you could keep going there. But I also want to come back to this idea of activism, because I do believe that activism is healing. Yeah. And I think that using your voice, whether it's being out at a protest, whether it's writing a letter to your elected officials, whether it is donating to causes, Black Lives Matter and other causes, whether it is using your social media platform to amplify causes and bring voice to the injustices that are happening. Whatever your form of activism is, whether it's art, right? Art is activism. Whatever it is, I think that is also a very important place, especially I feel like as Black community and as people of color, we're very artistic. That could be your song, it could be your dance. Those things are healing, and those things are important. And I also wanna bring voice to the fact that rest is healing and rest is important. We can't always be the person carrying the sign. It's important to tag in and tag out, and to allow for us to be a community that is supporting each other, and not one person that has to always carry the load. It's okay to take a break from the things that you need to take a break from. Maybe you've read about the recent traumatic event, but you didn't actually watch the video. I mean, it could, whatever it is that you need, I encourage you to do that as a place of healing. And again, I really do encourage you to think about healing in terms of bringing these things to God and being in connection together as a body of believers that have faith and that have hope. That change is possible and that healing is real and that God is protecting and that God is not asking us to walk and to live in fear, right? But that instead God is really arming us and equipping us with what we need to manage and to handle the life that is before us, and that it's the connection with yourself and seeing where you are in a moment and being honest with that and bringing voice to it and being vulnerable with it and sticking with that, that also allows you in that moment to connect with God and to hear what God is asking you to do in your healing journey and in the journey to heal those in the community that are around you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the piece about activism is a part of the healing process, right? We have 2 quick questions, and we're running short on time, right? So these are going to be straight fire. The first question, I have a response. You can have a response on that one. I have a theological response, and you can have your psychological response. And the second one is definitely for you, right? So the first question we have here is society's response to Black Lives Matter versus hashtag Black Lives Matter versus hashtag Stop Asian Hate was very much different. How do we deal with a society who recognizes trauma for one group but not for the other, right? So my theological response to this, right, is what I see in this text, right, and I found it very possible is, found very powerful rather, is Rachel was actually crying in Genesis 35. That's when the actual event happened. Jeremiah picks it up in Jeremiah 31, that Rachel is still crying. And then in Matthew 2, Matthew picks it up and says Rachel is still crying, right? And this is over the span of 4,000 years, right? That Rachel is still crying out, right? So it's this idea of that Rachel, to still lift up your voice, that even though they don't recognize them both as the same, and action moved very quickly for Stop Asian Hate and is still lethargic for Black Lives Matter. We still have to raise our voice. We still have to mourn and stay in that place of mourning and crying out until something changes. The one thing about the people of God crying out in all of the text is that there's a response to the crying out. And I think and that's where then after Rachel cries out, we see Jesus emerge on the scene, right? That was Matthew setting up, like that is the response, is the person and the witness and the model of Jesus as being the response. And that's how we continue moving on. Psychology.
Yeah, I would actually probably just echo that. So maybe you have a little bit of a psychological response in there. That like we're saying, it is still the place of staying in it and lifting your voice and being that advocate for change, even when it feels like, and it is the case, that the world around you may or may not be advocating with you, or maybe advocating for one group more than they're advocating for you. To still stick in there, to acknowledge what is happening, to allow yourself to be vulnerable about it, to raise your voice in response to it, and to not let it stop you in that path towards change and towards healing. I think that we know that anti-Black racism is long standing in the fabric of what is around us, right? And long standing that even as different marginalized groups, there is a different level of questioning and lack of acceptance. And even as I talked about just a little bit earlier, questioning the grief when it comes to racial trauma, when it's anti-Black racism. There's just a different level of continuing to question us. And yet still, we stay in there and we lift our voices and we amplify the voices of our community, and we continue to move forward and make progress in the same way that those that came before us have really laid the foundation for us to do.
Amen. Next question is, and this is a question I think goes to the whole psychological field, and I think I'll save you my commentary on it, but are there resources for people who don't have insurance? Because y'all psychologists are expensive.
Yes. Yes, psychologists are expensive. Yes, so are there resources for people who don't have insurance? So I'll say, there are actually still a lot of psychologists who will do pro bono work, and there are free services, and there are also a lot of psychologists that do sliding scale. It's actually a part of our ethics to have some level of giving back to communities and understanding, people's different financial situations. So even as you look through psychology today, or find referrals from friends, and I can probably provide some referrals. I can probably give Reverend Daryl some listings, and he can pass those along as well. But there are psychologists that do sliding scale fees that won't charge their full amount if somebody was self-pay or if they were using their insurance, and will be able to talk about and negotiate what is helpful for a person. But yes, psychologists are very expensive.
Yes.
We're sorry.
Well, we want to thank you, Dr. Siobhan Moore-Laban, for joining us this evening and for your insights on racial trauma and how it intersects with grief. So we think you're starting to fill out the picture. We've talked about the 5 and 7 stages of grief. Last week we talked about Black men grief. This week I heard the 4/5 responses to trauma. This is why I'm not a psychologist. And next week, so thank you for coming by here at Mount Olive Baptist Church. So over the last 3 weeks, we have been sharing with professional mental health caregivers from the psychiatric and psychological fields as we discuss managing grief. So we invite you next week, Wednesday, August 11th, for our final session on this important subject. We are pleased to welcome our own Dr. Alfie Breland-Noble, a pioneering psychologist, author, founder of mental health nonprofit, the Acoma Project, and host of the mental health podcast, Couched in Color with Dr. Alfie. She'll be discussing managing grief while caring for others. Come study with us next Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock on our social media platforms as we move forward to greater spiritual and mental health. Also, our reentry survey closes today. We have been surveying our congregation and friends of Mount Olive regarding your readiness to return to in-person worship and other gatherings. The survey closes tonight, so if you have not submitted your survey and you wish to have your views included in the collected data, you must complete it this evening. You should have received an electronic version of the survey or a paper copy if you requested one. We want to hear from you. We have gotten a tremendous response, but we want to hear from you as we consider how and when to gather again. Lastly, our sermon series, we have been journeying for the past month now, a sermon series, a battle plan for fighting giants. All people in all times have faced giants. However colossal the giants in our lives may be, the story of the shepherd boy David gives us instructions on confronting and defeating the obstacles in our lives. Join us this month as Pastor Victor continues exploring the lessons found in 1 Samuel 17 as battle plan for fighting giants. Worship is available on all social media platforms at 9:30 a.m. each Sunday, and we are so thankful that you have joined us for this Bible study. Come back next week as we close out this series on managing grief. We pray that it has been a blessing for you, and we will see you next week. God bless you.